I think there's some hurt feelings and misunderstandings and influencing that's been happening, some pretty intense influencing. And I just feel like that for your kids to have a relationship with you and for you to have one with them and for them to have one with me.
Exhausted and so tired of being blamed for how his kids feel about him. It's his responsibility, not mine.
Look, I wish I had a lot of influence on my adult children. Boy, things would be really different.
I've reached out to every one of my children. I've reached out to every one of my children, and multiple times. And if they don't have a relationship with me, it's because they're not reciprocating.
Why are we still getting blamed for a family he tore apart? That's the line Christine said during a quiet moment off camera, and it set off a chain reaction that still hasn't settled. And the truth is, she's not wrong. For years now, Christine and Janelle were blamed for breaking up the Brown family. The two wives who bailed. The wives who walked away. The wives who gave up. It's the same story Kody repeats every time he's on his back foot. But now, with more of the kids speaking out and more details surfacing, Christine and Janelle are refusing to carry his version of the blame. They're finally calling out what really happened inside the Brown household, and the tension is bigger than anything 2LG has ever shown. So let's get into this, because the way this exploded behind the scenes is just something the cameras were built to handle. Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we are getting into something that's been in the making for years and is finally boiling over. The story right now is Christine and Janelle are done taking the blame for the Brown family falling apart, and honestly they're just not being subtle about it anymore. The narrative has always leaned a certain way. Kody talks of betrayal, and he talks of loyalty. But when you start listening to what Christine and Janelle have been saying in interviews and their quiet moments with the kids, and even in those scenes that feel a little too raw for television, a different picture forms, and that picture points to something simple. They're not going to absorb responsibility for choices that weren't theirs. So let's walk through what they're actually saying, why they're saying it now, and why the tension inside this family has hit a point that even Tara T can't smooth over. Here's the idea that's been floating around, and it lines up with what we've been watching for the last few seasons. Kody isn't just frustrated that Christine and Janelle left, he's trying to rewrite the breakup so he doesn't have to face his own part in it, and the easiest way to rewrite history is to hand the blame to the people who walked out the door. But Christine and Janelle are finally pushing back on that. They're making it clear that they didn't break the family, they reacted to a family that was already breaking. When you look at the pattern, the distance, the favoritism, the resentment, the endless arguments about loyalty, it makes sense, because if Kody admits that his decisions cracked the family open, then he also has to admit that losing 3 marriages, it was the cost of choices he doesn't want to talk about. And that's why both Christine and Janelle are refusing to let this narrative stick to them anymore. They're not taking responsibility for a collapse that was already in motion long before they stepped away, so let's back up for a second and look at how this actually unfolded. The cracks in the Brown family didn't start when Christine left. They didn't start when Janelle finally walked away either. It was a shift that started years ago, when the family moved and reshuffled and tried to rebuild dynamics that were already strained. Every season showed pieces of it. Kody's growing focus on Robin, the constant tension over decision-making, the argument about loyalty, the way he slowly stopped showing up for kids who didn't live under Robin's roof. Christine felt it first. She talked about feeling invisible. She talked about being the last priority. She talked about how she can't get even basic emotional same, and every time she brought it up, the response was always the same. Be patient, be loyal, be committed to the big picture. Janelle tried to hang on longer. She kept saying they could work through it, even when everything was pointing in the opposite direction, but eventually it got to a point where she couldn't ignore what was right in front of her. Kody was only interested in a version of the family where everyone revolved around him, not each other, and by the time Christine actually made the decision to leave, every one of the older kids already understood why she was doing it. By the time Janelle started thinking about walking too, everyone else saw the writing on the wall. So the idea that the family somehow broke because they left just does not match what was actually happening inside the house. The family was already splitting into separate worlds. And they were simply the first ones to stop pretending it wasn't. This is where everything starts to come into fusing the blame. It isn't a kiss about one moment or one argument. It about a long pattern that kept repeating itself until neither of them could ignore it anymore. The heart of the conflict comes down to this: Kody created a version of the family that only worked for him, and when it stopped working for everyone else, he treated that as betrayal. Look at the choices he made over time. He slowly pulled himself out of the homes that didn't fit the life he wanted. He spent more time with Robin and her kids. He justified it by saying they were But that kind of comparison has consequences, especially in a plural family, where every wife is supposed to have an equal place at the table. Christine felt that first she'd always been open about how much she wanted a united, cooperative family. Her whole identity was built on making that big structure work. The cooking, the holidays, the traditions, the emotional glue, she carried most of it. So when the structure started shifting toward one wife and one household, she lost the purpose she had devoted her entire adult life to. But instead of acknowledging any of that, Kody kept acting like Christine gave up too easily. He said she chose to be unhappy. He said her reasons weren't valid. He said she even rejected the family because she didn't want to live his way meanwhile. All she wanted was the man she married to show up in her life again. Janelle's side of the story adds another layer. She'd always been the practical one, the steady one, the person who can endure long stretches of emotional distance. For years, she let things slide because she believed the whole family could still function if they worked together. She did panic when Kody leaned too heavily toward Robin. She assumed he'd balance things out eventually, but that never happened. The longer the imbalance went on, the clearer it became that Kody wasn't interested in fixing it. He wanted Janelle to fall in line with rules she had no part in creating, rules that benefited one wife-free household and restricted everyone else. And when she questioned him, he treated it like disloyalty instead of partnership. So when Kody turned around and blamed them for the family falling apart, it felt like a slap in the face. Neither of them left on a whim. They left because the man at the center of the family had already checked out of their marriages, then acted shocked when they noticed, and that in the part Christine and Janelle won't accept anymore. They won't let him paint himself as the victim of choices he pushed them into. They won't sit quietly while he spins a version of the story where they're the ones who didn't try. Because from their point of view, they spent years trying. They just eventually realized they were the only ones doing the work. As the months went by, the tension inside the family wasn't just emotional. It started popping up in small, uncomfortable ways that everyone around them could feel. Even the kids noticed it long before the adults said anything out loud. There were moments during filming where you could almost see Christine shut down the second Kody walked into the room. She'd try to keep it light, but her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. She wasn't angry in those moments. She was tired. It was the look of someone who had explained the same problem 100 times and realized the person on the other side wasn't listening. Janelle handled it differently. She stayed calm the way she always does, but she started drawing boundaries. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. Whenever Kody tried to push the idea that she wasn't supportive, she would look at him with that quiet, steady stare that said she knew the truth even if he didn't want to hear it. Those moments made Kody defensive. He doesn't respond well to calm resistance. He wants agreement. He wants validation. When he doesn't get it, he turns frustration into long lectures about loyalty and commitment. He talks louder. He talks faster. He tries to overwhelm the disagreement instead of understanding. That's when things really started to crack. There was talked about later, where Christine finally said she couldn't keep doing this version of the family. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse him. She simply said she needed a marriage where she mattered, and if that wasn't possible, she needed a life where she could breathe again. Instead of hearing her, Kody took it as a threat. He framed it as her giving up, even though all she was doing was telling the truth about how disconnected things had become. Janelle, watching all of this, started to realize something important. If Christine could say it out loud, then maybe she could too. She'd spent years adjusting to whatever the situation was, keeping peace, trying to keep things functional, but at some point, functional turned into surviving, and surviving turned into silence. The family dinners grew awkward. The kids were split between households that barely interacted, and every time Kody tried to rally everyone together, the effort felt forced, like he was trying to glue pieces back onto something. That wasn't structurally sound anymore. By the time the cameras caught on, the emotional distance wasn't subtle. You could see the separation forming in real time. Christine knew she was already halfway out. Janelle was still trying to hang on, but her grip was loosening, and Kody had no idea how much ground he was losing. From the outside, it looked like things were just tense. But inside the family, everyone could feel what was coming. If there was a moment when everything shifted from quiet tension to unavoidable reality, it was when the kids started voicing what they'd been holding in for years. They weren't attacking anyone. They weren't choosing sides. They were just finally saying what they'd watched happen inside the family long before any breakup became official. It started with the older kids. They'd lived through every move, every argument, every change in the family structure. They saw how things shifted after Robin came into the picture. They noticed how their dad's time slowly centered around one household more than the others, and they saw what it did to their moms, and eventually, the tradition just faded. Another kid shared how it felt to go from having a present dad to one who always had an excuse. They'd ask when he was coming over. They'd ask if he could make it to a game or a school event, and they'd hear that he was busy, or that he needed to be with the younger kids, the ones at Robin's house. They said it kindly, but the pain behind their words was obvious. Christine and Janelle heard their kids talk about this, and something clicked. They weren't imagining the shift. They weren't exaggerating the imbalance. Their kids had been quietly carrying the same confusion, disappointment, and frustration they were trying to navigate as adults. One of the most telling moments came from a conversation where a daughter said she stopped asking her dad for anything because she got tired of being turned down. She didn't say it with anger, she said it with acceptance, the kind that only comes from being let down too many times. And that hit Christine hard, because for her, the kids had always been the reason she stayed through the hardest years. Janelle's kids were even more direct. They talked about feeling like their dad was more interested in proving them wrong than understanding what they were trying to say. Whenever they voiced concerns, he treated it like disrespect. Whenever they questioned his decisions, he acted like they were attacking him. It became easier to stay quiet than try to get through to someone who wasn't listening. And this is where the real shift happened. The kids weren't blaming Christine or Janelle for anything. They didn't see their moms as the reason the family fell apart. They saw the imbalance. They saw the favoritism. They saw the growing distance. They saw the truth up close. When Christine heard her kids say all this, something inside her settled. She realized she wasn't leaving a marriage that could be fixed. She was leaving a version of the family that no longer existed. When Janelle heard her kids speak up, it shook her. She had spent so much time trying to hold the structure together that she hadn't stopped to look at how it was affecting her children. She started to understand that staying, just for the sake of staying, wasn't actually helping anyone. And Kody, he didn't react well. Instead of using their honesty as a wake-up call, he treated it like rebellion. He said the kids were being influenced. He said they didn't appreciate the sacrifices he made. He said they should show him respect, even if he wasn't meeting them halfway. It was one of the clearest signs that he wasn't ready to face the role he played in the breakdown. The kids weren't attacking him. They were describing their experience, but he couldn't see past his own frustration. That is when the divide inside the family became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just between husband and wives anymore. It was between a father and his own children. And once that happened, there was no going back. The real turning point came when Christine stopped waiting for things to change. For years, she had been trying to make the best of a situation that kept slipping further out of her control. She kept hoping for effort, for reassurance, for any sign that her marriage still mattered. But when nothing shifted, something inside her finally did. There was a moment during a family discussion that never aired, but people close to them talked about it later. Christine had brought up how distant things felt and asked Kody what he wanted their marriage to look like going forward. She wasn't looking for a fight. She was looking for honesty. But instead of giving her clarity, he gave her another lecture about how she needed to be more committed, more loyal, more patient. It sounded like the same speech she'd heard a dozen times, and it hit her that he wasn't actually answering her question. He was asking her to adjust again. He was asking her to carry the weight again. He was asking her to fix a marriage he wasn't showing up for. After that conversation, she sat alone in her car for almost an hour. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was processing the fact that the relationship she had been trying to save might already be gone. She later said that was the moment she realized she couldn't keep fighting for something. One-sided Janelle's turning point happened differently. She didn't have a single moment. Hers was a slow buildup that finally reached a breaking point. She kept trying to talk through problems, kept trying to find middle ground, kept trying to be reasonable. But every time she brought up something important, it turned into an argument about respect. She'd leave the conversations feeling like nothing was resolved, and she was somehow still the one being blamed. The final straw for Janelle came during a talk about the kids. She wanted Kody to reconnect with them, to mend the distance that had grown between him and some of the older children. Instead of hearing her, he told her the kids needed to apologize to him. He didn't ask what hurt them. He didn't ask why they were pulling away. He just wanted them to admit fault so he could move on. That bothered Janelle more than she expected. She had been holding the family together for years, helping the kids navigate their emotions while trying to keep peace with their dad, and now she was watching him refuse to take even a small step toward repairing the relationship. Later that night, she talked to one of her daughters, who admitted she wasn't expecting anything from her dad anymore. She said she still loved him, but she didn't know how to trust him with her feelings. Hearing that broke something open for Janelle. She realized she couldn't protect her kids from the disappointment anymore. She also realized she couldn't keep pretending the distance wasn't there. From that point on, the air between Kody and the two women felt heavier, conversations became shorter, patience wore thin. Every attempt to fix things felt like patching holes in a sinking ship, and here's where everything truly shifted. For the first time, Christine and Janelle stopped trying to convince themselves that the marriage could go back to what it used to be. They saw the damage clearly. They saw what their kids were feeling. And they saw that Kody wasn't ready to acknowledge any of it. That clarity didn't make the decision easier, but it made it unavoidable. Both of them, in their own separate ways, reached the point at which staying felt more painful than leaving. And once that line was crossed, the family would never be the same again. What really set it into explosive territory was the fact that Kody realized he was no longer controlling the narrative. He had, for years, been framing the issues and defining the real problems and who was loyal and who wasn't. But once Christine left and Janelle started pulling away, that grip slipped fast. He tried to keep things framed the way he always had. He talked about betrayal. He talked about broken promises. He talked about his wives choosing independence over the family. But this time, the people around him weren't buying it. The kids weren't quiet. Christine wasn't quiet. Janelle, who usually tried to keep the peace, wasn't quiet either. And the thing that rattled him most was that their stories matched, not in rehearsed talking points, not in coordinated complaints, in lived experience. They described the same patterns. They had the same frustrations. They recalled the same conversations that left them confused and hurt. Their accounts lined up in a way that he couldn't dismiss as coincidence, and that made him angry because if they were telling the truth, then the problem wasn't their disloyalty. The problem was his behavior. There was a moment during a group discussion when Kody tried to take control again. He brought up old sacrifices, old wounds. He talked about how hard he worked for the family, but instead of falling silent, Christine calmly said she appreciated his efforts, and then pointed out that effort in the past didn't excuse neglect in the present. You could see the shock on his face. He wasn't used to Christine pushing back with that kind of clarity. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't confrontational. She was simply honest. Then Janelle spoke up too. She said she didn't want to argue anymore. She said she wanted respect and communication, not guilt and lectures. She said she didn't want to live in a version of the family where her voice only mattered when it matched his. Kody didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't prepared for both of them standing firm at the same time. He tried to redirect the conversation again, shifting the blame back toward choices they made. But the more he talked, the more disconnected he seemed from what they were actually saying. This was the moment viewers later described as the point where the emotional walls became visible. Christine had already stepped out mentally. Janelle was halfway there, and Kody was still arguing from a place that didn't match the reality in front of him. One person close to the family later said that it was like watching a man argue with a version of the wives he had built in his head, not the women sitting across from him. He kept insisting they fix what he believed was broken. They kept pointing to what was actually broken, and the two versions didn't match. When the kids found out about that conversation, they weren't surprised. They said it sounded exactly like the talks they'd had with him. They said it was the same pattern. They said he listened only long enough to defend himself, not long enough to understand what they needed. That's when the story slipped completely out of his hands. He had been shaping the narrative for years, but now the people who had lived through the choices were finally telling their side. There was no way to spin that because too many voices were confirming the same story. Not exaggerated, not dramatic, just honest. And the truth was simple. Christine didn't break the family. Janelle didn't break the family. The family was already fractured, and the people who had been absorbing the damage were finally stepping out of the blast radius. Kody wasn't losing wives. He was losing the ability to blame them for choices he didn't want to face. And that loss hit him harder than anything else. While all of this was unfolding behind closed doors, the public perception remained largely one-sided for years. TLC viewers were shown a version of the Brown family, where Christine and Janelle's departures were framed as choices made impulsively or selfishly. Social media forums and tabloids jumped on that narrative and amplified it. The wives leave, Kody suffers. But behind the cameras, the reality was far more complex. Those who were close to the family described a long, consistent pattern of neglect, favoritism, and manipulation that contributed to the breakdown. Christine and Janelle didn't walk away because they wanted to punish Kody or cause drama. They left because the emotional and structural foundations of the family had already eroded. One insider shared that the producers often tried to condense these complicated dynamics into a few short scenes, which naturally skewed the story. A tense moment would be edited into a fight, a quiet withdrawal would become resignation, and moments of clarity were often cut for airtime. Christine's perspective, in particular, was that the public had a very incomplete view of her actions and intentions. She had spent decades trying to keep the family connected, sacrificing her own emotional well-being to maintain peace. And now, when she finally prioritized herself, it looked to some viewers like abandonment. Janelle experienced something similar. Despite her careful efforts to maintain stability, many perceived her as passive or disengaged. In truth, she had been actively navigating a minefield of unrealistic expectations, conflicting loyalties, and Kody's inconsistent behavior. The longer she stayed, the more she realized her voice was being minimized, her concerns dismissed, and her role reduced to a symbol of loyalty rather than an actual partner. The stark contrast between what the cameras showed and what was actually happening created a tension that both Christine and Janelle struggled with publicly. They were constantly having to defend themselves, both privately and online, against accusations they knew were false. That defense was exhausting, further cementing their resolve to step back and take control of their own narratives. What finally made it concrete in their minds was a realization. If they didn't finally stop letting Kody frame the story, the public would never understand the true dynamics of the family. They were protecting their kids and their reputations, not just themselves. Christine and Janelle weren't leaving out of anger or spite. They were leaving to reclaim autonomy, truth, and clarity. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. From the outside, it looked like drama and conflict. From the inside, it was clarity and survival. This is where tension inside the Brown family reaches its real breaking point. The private reality has caught up to the public story, and there is no way to reconcile the two without a huge confrontation. The breaking point didn't happen quietly. Once Christine and Janelle began openly refusing to take the blame, it triggered a series of confrontations that hadn't existed before. These weren't the polished, edited moments erupting across the television screen. These were raw, emotional exchanges that showed just how deep the fractures ran. One of the most significant confrontations occurs during a family meeting. Kody tries to reassert his grip on reality by framing the discussion in terms of loyalty and respect, with Christine and Janelle being at fault for the family. Breakdown Kody speaks in a measured tone to sound calm. But there is tension underneath, an undeniable sense of urgency behind him, like he knows he is losing his grip. Christine did not impulsively react. She did not yell. She did not storm out. Instead, she listed calmly all the years of sacrifices she had made, the emotional labor she had invested, and the constant disregard she had suffered. She pointed out the imbalance, the favoritism toward Robin and her children, and how everyone else suffered as a result. Janelle followed, echoing Christine's points, but in her own particular way. She emphasized she had tried to make it work, that she had accommodated endless shifts in priorities, and that she had upheld every expectation placed on her. And yet, when the system failed, she wasn't the one at fault. Kody's reaction was telling. Instead of listening, he doubled down, accusing them of being ungrateful, unfair, and disconnected from the big picture. He tried to leverage guilt and loyalty as weapons, but the women didn't falter. They were resolute, unwavering, and articulate. The tension in the room was palpable. Even the kids, who had been watching for years, could sense that something fundamental had shifted. Their parents were no longer speaking in the same language of blame and justification. Christine and Janelle were speaking truth. Kody was speaking defensiveness. This escalation didn't stay contained. Private conversations turned into whispered debates. Family gatherings became uncomfortable. Even casual moments felt loaded with unspoken tension. It wasn't just about who was right or wrong anymore. It was about power, control, and narrative ownership. Christine and Janelle had taken control of their narrative. Kody was trying to hold onto his version of reality. And when narratives collide in a family like this, everyone feels the impact. The energy became suffocating, with every interaction reminding them of past grievances, unhealed wounds, and unresolved conflicts. From a viewer's perspective, the drama seemed heightened, but in reality, it was the collision of long-standing patterns with newfound accountability. Christine and Janelle's refusal to accept blame wasn't rebellion. It was the inevitable outcome of years of imbalance, neglect, and frustration. And that's when the tension truly exploded. Once Christine and Janelle drew their line in the sand, the effects rippled throughout the Brown family. This wasn't limited to confrontations with Kody. It affected the children, the extended family, and even the way fans perceived the family dynamic. The kids felt it immediately. For years, they had been caught between households, between expectations, and between competing loyalties. With Christine and Janelle no longer taking on undue blame, the children began to see the truth more clearly. They realized that the breakdown wasn't their mother's fault, and that shifted their perspective dramatically. Some of the older kids started speaking more openly about their experiences. They no longer felt the need to placate Kody or suppress their own frustrations. They could be disappointed, confused, or even angry without fear of their feelings being twisted into blame. In many ways, the children were finally seeing a version of the family where truth came before appearances. The extended family reacted differently, though. Some sided with Kody, either out of loyalty or habit, while others quietly acknowledged Christine and Janelle had been treated unfairly for years. Family gatherings started to become more tense because this unspoken acknowledgement of injustice disrupted the old equilibrium. Those who benefited from the previous narrative found positions harder to maintain, and that created friction even outside of the immediate household. Fans of the show also began to notice the shift. On social media, conversations began to reflect a more nuanced understanding of the situation. People were no longer just blaming the wives for leaving. They were calling into question the dynamics, the behavior of Kody, and the deep structural issues which had led to the breakdown in the first place. Supporters of Christine and Janelle praised them for standing up for themselves and taking back their narratives, while critics of Kody began to vocalize the discrepancies they'd been seeing for years. Even the production team had to adjust. Storylines could no longer rely on the old framing of Kody as the sympathetic husband dealing with departing wives. The content had to reflect the reality Christine and Janelle were articulating, which changed the way the family was portrayed on screen. That shift in storytelling put additional pressure on Kody, whose attempts to control the narrative were now under public scrutiny. At the heart of it, this ripple effect highlighted one central truth: when Christine and Janelle refused to absorb blame, they didn't just protect themselves, but disrupted the entire ecosystem of the family. The imbalance that had persisted for years began to unravel, exposing long-hidden resentments, favoritism, and emotional neglect. The Brown family, for the first time, had to confront the reality that the breakdown wasn't a single event or a simple decision. It was a structural failure that had been building over years, and Christine and Janelle were no longer willing to pretend otherwise. And with that acknowledgement, the tension reached its peak. Everything that had been simmering under the surface for years was now out in the open, impossible to ignore and impossible to reverse. After the confrontations and the ripple effects, the Brown family entered a new phase, one marked by reflection, grudging acceptance, and for some heartbreak. Christine and Janelle weren't retreating out of anger. They were creating space for clarity, self-respect, and healing. But that clarity came at a cost. For Kody, the aftermath was a hard reality check. The attempts to control the narrative, maintain authority, and deflect blame no longer worked. The public was no longer seeing only his side. His children were expressing themselves, his wives were articulating their experiences, and the truth of the family's dynamics could no longer be contained. That reality forced him into a position he hadn't prepared for: accountability. Christine spent this period reflecting on what she had endured and how she had grown. She realized that her identity had been tied so closely to her role in the family that stepping back initially felt like losing herself. But the truth was the opposite. Leaving the blame behind allowed her to reclaim autonomy, voice, and agency. She could define her own happiness rather than constantly adjusting to a man who refused to meet her halfway. Janelle's reflection was more practical, but equally profound. She recognized the years she had spent mediating, balancing, and sacrificing. In doing so, she had prioritized family stability over personal truth. Now, with the constraints lifted, she began rebuilding boundaries, redefining her role as a mother, and asserting her presence in ways that were authentic rather than performative. For the children, the aftermath was a lesson in observation and understanding. They saw that adults could disagree, set boundaries, and still love each other. They saw that truth wasn't about picking sides, but about acknowledging reality even when it was uncomfortable. They witnessed their mother's courage in refusing to carry blame that wasn't theirs, which became a formative example of standing firm without malice. The broader family dynamic shifted as well. Extended family members had to confront the disparities in treatment and favoritism that had gone unspoken for years. Some were resistant, clinging to old allegiances, but others quietly acknowledged the imbalance. It became increasingly clear that the old patterns of unquestioned loyalty were no longer sustainable. Even the media and public reaction mirrored this shift. Audiences began seeing Christine and Janelle not as women who left, but as women who had endured systemic inequality and made empowered choices. Their narrative was no longer about drama, it was about resilience, honesty, and refusing to accept false blame. Ultimately, this period was about reevaluation for everyone involved. Christine and Janelle had reclaimed themselves. The children had clarity about their family's reality. Kody faced a stark contrast between perception and reality, and the family as a whole had to navigate a new terrain of honesty, accountability, and boundaries. The tension hadn't disappeared, it had transformed. What once simmered under the surface was now visible, undeniable, and shaping the family's future in ways that couldn't be reversed. Christine and Janelle's refusal to accept the blame had not just changed them, it had changed the entire narrative of the Brown family. With the dust settling, the Brown family entered an entirely new chapter, one defined less by appearances and more by reality. Christine and Janelle had made the difficult but necessary choice to refuse blame for the family's breakdown, and that decision reverberated through every relationship they had with Kody, the children, and even the extended family. Christine moved forward with a sense of purpose. She was no longer trying to fix what couldn't be repaired. Instead, she focused on her own life, her passions, and her relationships outside the confines of a marriage that had demanded she constantly compromise her own needs. Her voice, once muted under layers of obligation and guilt, was now strong, clear, and unapologetic. Janelle also embraced a new chapter. She started setting boundaries that were long overdue, protecting her emotional well-being while being present for her children in a way that was healthy and sustainable. She learned that compromise was only meaningful when mutual, and she refused to carry any burdens that were never hers to carry. The children now felt a clearer sense of their family dynamics. They were seeing accountability and honesty could coexist with love. Boundaries weren't acts of rebellion, but necessary safeguards, and the way adults modeled resilience in the face of dysfunction. And Kody, for the first time, had to deal with the consequences of his longtime patterns. He no longer controlled the narrative. His actions, decisions, and favoritisms were clear to the people closest to him, and the stories being told weren't all filtered through his eyes. The balance of power shifted, and Kody had to face his own role in the family's fragmentation. This kind of transformation did not happen overnight, and the tension didn't totally disappear. There were still old wounds, old habits crept in, and difficult conversations were still to be had. But the difference was very profound. No longer were Christine and Janelle stuck in these vicious cycles of guilt and blame. They had chosen autonomy, clarity, and honesty, and in doing so they had permanently changed the course of the family. Ultimately, this chapter was about more than separation or conflict. It was about truth, empowerment, and the courage to step out of an unhealthy pattern. Christine and Janelle refused to be the scapegoats of dysfunction they did not create. In refusing to do that, they redefined not just their lives, but the narrative of the Brown family itself. As cameras continued to roll, viewers could see tension, confrontations, and the tectonic shifts in dynamics. Behind it, though, lay a lesson: even as families may fracture, the truth and self-respect are never negotiable. And for Christine and Janelle, it was that truth which had finally set them free.